On live national television, Jimmy Kimmel looked Donald Trump dead in the eye, calmly dropped a plain manila folder on his desk, and in one brutal moment completely demolished the decades-long myth of Trump as the 180 IQ stable genius, exposing the B-average legacy kid who paid other students to do his homework, bombed his own exams, and spent 50 years lying to America about being the smartest man alive. Tonight, Donald Trump once again told the world he has a 180 IQ. So I did what any responsible adult would do. I called his old school. The audience laughed, but Jimmy didn't laugh. Usually there was a smirk or a joke to soften the hit. Not tonight. His face stayed completely calm. Jimmy hit a button and the big screen behind him lit up with the clip from Trump's latest rally. There was Donald Trump saying, "I have a 180 IQ, folks. 1 at 80. I'm a stable genius, believe me." Jimmy let the clip continue longer than expected. Then suddenly, freeze frame. Trump's face locked on screen mid-smirk. Jimmy leaned forward slightly. He says it every single time. The question is, who is he still trying to convince? Here's the thing. I sent Donald an invitation for a live video call tonight. And you know what? He accepted. The giant monitor flashed alive, and there he was, Donald Trump, live from Mar-a-Lago, sitting in a gold-trimmed chair with that same confident grin. Trump immediately started talking. "Jimmy, let me tell you, this is going to be tremendous. I'm the smartest guy ever to run for president. 180 IQ, Wharton. Perfect memory." Jimmy didn't blink. He simply reached down, pressed one button, and Trump's audio vanished instantly. Silence. Trump kept talking, mouth moving, hands waving, but no sound came out. Jimmy finally glanced over at the monitor. "We'll get back to you in a minute, Donald, but first let's talk about what you actually said." Trump's face turned darker. He slammed one hand down on the desk in front of him, still muted. Jimmy reached beneath the desk and pulled out a plain manila folder. He placed the folder on the desk carefully, then opened it slowly, page by page. "Donald loves talking about Wharton," Jimmy said calmly. "He says he was top of his class, the smartest guy in every room." Jimmy lifted the first document. "But here's what the actual records show. This is Donald Trump's Wharton transcript. B average. No honors. Not even close to top 10%. Jimmy kept flipping pages. No academic distinctions. No elite recognition. No evidence of genius-level performance. He graduated. Absolutely. But the legend he built around it doesn't match the paperwork." Jimmy reached deeper into the folder. "And this one gets interesting." He pulled out another document. Older paper, faded slightly. A professor's handwritten evaluation. Jimmy read slowly. "Energy high. Analytical work mediocre at best. Relies more on bold assertions than careful reasoning or evidence." Then boom. Trump's audio suddenly blasted back on. "Fake news. This is rigged. I was the best student at Wharton." Jimmy calmly pressed the button again. Silence. Trump muted once more. Jimmy said, "We'll let you speak when you're ready to address the papers, Donald, not before." He pulled out another page, and here's an email chain from 1967 between two professors. It says, "Donald repeatedly requested extensions, reminders, and additional time on assignments." Jimmy zoomed the email onto the giant display, every word visible. "We're just getting started tonight." The folder was thick. Trump kept raging silently on screen. Jimmy stared into the camera for 12 full seconds. Then he lowered his eyes to one final page. According to verified standardized testing records from that era, Donald Trump's IQ tested at 124. Above average? Absolutely. 180? No. Trump erupted instantly when unmuted. "This is a hoax. Low IQ Jimmy Kimmel. Nobody watches your garbage show. I have the best memory in the world, the highest IQ. Everybody knows it." Jimmy sat completely still, letting him spiral for 45 straight seconds. Trump kept going. "I built a massive empire. I became president. You're jealous. Very sad." When Trump finally paused for air, Jimmy calmly pulled out another document. "Here's a letter from the Wharton admissions office. Legacy admission approved through family connections. No academic distinction noted." Trump immediately lunged toward the camera. "Fake. Totally fabricated." Jimmy didn't even look at him. "Zero academic awards. Zero special achievements. Just money, connections, and a famous father." Jimmy slowly turned another page, then another, then laid two documents side by side. Now this is where things get ugly. 1967 bank transfer. Donald Trump paid another student to write 3 major assignments. $1,200 at the time. About $12,000 today. Signatures, transfer records, dates, everything visible. Trump exploded. "I'll sue everybody. This is fake. Fabricated." He slammed both fists onto the desk. Jimmy stayed calm. "Donald, that's your signature." He dropped another bomb. Two professors independently noted the sudden improvement in the papers submitted afterward. This reads like it was written by someone else. Quality inconsistent with previous work. Jimmy leaned forward slightly. If your memory is so perfect, why did multiple professors write that your assignments lacked depth and required major rewrites? Trump froze for half a second, then exploded again. Witch hunt, low IQ, people jealous. Jimmy rested his hand on the folder again. These aren't attacks, Donald. These are your own records. And we're not done yet. The screen split in half. A new face appeared. An older man, late 70s, calm expression. This is Richard Harlan, Donald Trump's classmate at Wharton in 1967. Richard didn't hesitate. I wrote those papers for Donald. He paid me cash. 3 assignments, $1,200. Trump went insane. Liar. Paid off. Richard looked directly at Trump.
You paid me twice in your dorm room. You said you were too busy helping your father's business. Richard lifted a handwritten note. Need this by Friday. Same rate. Don't make it too obvious. Donald. Trump stared at his own handwriting. For one terrifying second, he went silent. When he came back, his voice sounded weaker. This is a witch hunt. Jimmy moved in for another strike. Donald keeps saying he has the greatest memory in the world. A pre-recorded video appeared. An elderly professor. I'm Professor Alan Whitaker. I taught Donald Trump economics in 1967. Trump's recall of facts is selective and often inaccurate. He struggles with retaining detailed information and frequently confuses key concepts. Jimmy cut to scanned exam papers. Red marks everywhere. Factual errors. Needs revision. Incomplete recall. Trump kept repeating, I have perfect memory. Best memory. Jimmy lifted one final exam sheet. The professor's note at the bottom. Student relies on bluffing rather than knowledge. Trump kept looping phrases desperately. Everybody knows. Tremendous memory. Jimmy looked directly at him. Your own papers say otherwise. Trump snapped. I'm suing the show. I'm suing the network. I'll own this network. Jimmy calmly reached into the folder again. Interesting. You mentioned lawsuits. He revealed another document, court filing from the 1970s involving academic misrepresentation. You settled quietly. He revealed one more page, an internal Trump Organization email from 2015. Do not release academic records under any circumstance. Jimmy waited patiently, then leaned forward. You keep saying numbers don't matter, Donald, yet you spent 50 years lying about them, 50 years bragging, 50 years hiding, 50 years attacking everyone who questioned you. Jimmy stood up. We've heard from classmates, we've seen receipts, we've read the papers, but now it's time to hear from the man who actually graded Donald Trump himself. Please welcome retired Wharton professor Dr. Martin Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds sat beside Jimmy. Original essays, original exams, original notes. Lacks depth, surface-level analysis, unsupported claims, missing substance, Trump screamed from the monitor. This guy is ancient. He doesn't remember anything. Dr. Reynolds turned slowly toward the screen. I gave you a B, Donald. You had confidence, energy, ambition, but your work rarely went beyond the surface. Jimmy looked into the camera and delivered the line. Intelligence isn't a costume you wear to belittle other people. It's what remains when the lights are on. The papers are real. Trump sat frozen on the monitor, exhausted, humiliated. The next night, Dr. Reynolds returned carrying an even larger folder. I went through more archives last night. I found letters from additional classmates. More scans appeared, more handwriting, more receipts, more confirmations. Trump kept going live, trying to fight back. But now the energy felt different, forced, desperate. His slogan sounded tired. I have the best memory. Even his supporters seemed quieter. On the following episode, Jimmy stepped onto the stage. Myths die when someone finally forces them to sit still long enough to be measured. Much later that night, Jimmy sat alone at his desk with the plain manila folder. He opened it one last time, slowly flipped through the pages, then closed it gently. The loudest myth in modern politics had finally been forced to sit still beneath bright lights, and once measured, it would never sound quite the same again. The remark didn't come during a punchline. It appeared in the middle of a Trump rally clip. Trump was addressing an enthusiastic crowd, targeting one of his critics by calling him a low IQ lawyer before broadening the attack. Kimmel allowed the clip to finish. He let the echoes fade completely. Then he asked the production team to replay only the final sentence. Low IQ lawyer.
Without the cheering crowd, the insult sounded different, less like confidence, more like someone reaching for an easy escape. Kimmel studied the screen, nodded once, and slowly walked toward his desk. He reached beneath his desk and picked up a yellow legal pad. Since Trump had chosen to attack a low IQ lawyer, Kimmel decided to treat the comment as if it were evidence being presented in court. A sudden clip cut through, Trump saying, "Are the Democrats really surprised? In fact, this is my 4th such test. All perfect.
120 correct answers out of 120 questions asked. They're the same 30 questions over and over again. Continuing directly from the explosive revelations in the first segment, Jimmy Kimmel kept the pressure on without mercy as the live video feed showed Donald Trump still visibly rattled and sweating on the giant monitor with his mouth moving silently at first before being unmuted again, only to launch into another tirade of denials and threats. That Richard Harlan, the calm, collected Wharton classmate from 1967, sat there unflinching and began recounting in precise detail every interaction he had with the young Donald Trump, explaining how Trump had approached him multiple times in their dorm room, complaining about being too busy with his father's real estate business to handle the heavy workload of economics and finance assignments himself, and how on 3 separate occasions he had transferred cash payments totaling $1,200 in 1967 money, which would equate to roughly $12,000 in today's value, for Richard to complete major papers and projects that Trump then submitted as his own work, with Richard providing verbatim quotes from the handwritten notes Trump had slipped under his door, demanding the work be completed by specific Fridays without making the improvement too obvious, so as not to raise suspicions from professors who had already noted inconsistencies in Trump's earlier submissions that lacked depth and relied heavily on bold but unsupported assertions rather than careful research or original analysis. And as Richard spoke, the screen displayed zoomed-in scans of those very notes in Trump's own handwriting alongside bank transfer records from the era showing clear signatures and dates that matched perfectly with the assignment due dates on file at Wharton, leaving no room for ambiguity, as the audience sat in stunned silence before erupting into gasps and then sustained applause that only grew louder when Richard lifted yet another preserved document, this one a confirmation note from Trump himself, agreeing to the same rate for future work if needed, and Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward calmly, interjecting only to ask pointed follow-up questions that forced Richard to elaborate on how Trump had bragged, even back then, about having a photographic memory and superior intellect, yet consistently struggled with retaining key concepts and often requested extensions or additional help from multiple classmates, not just him, which aligned precisely with the email chains from professors that had already been revealed earlier in the show, detailing repeated requests for more time and special considerations that were granted due to family connections, but never resulted in the kind of elite academic performance Trump would later claim for decades on the campaign trail and in interviews where he repeatedly insisted he was the smartest person ever to attend Wharton or run for president with a supposed 180 IQ score that stood in stark contrast to the verified 124 IQ from standardized tests of that era, which, while above average, was nowhere near the genius level he projected. And as Trump tried to interrupt with shouts of fake news and witch hunt and low IQ, Jimmy, the audio was muted once more, allowing Richard to continue uninterrupted, describing how after the paid assignments were submitted, professors had independently noted sudden jumps in quality that seemed inconsistent with Trump's previous work, which had been described in handwritten evaluations as mediocre at best, surface-level analysis, heavy on bravado but light on substance and evidence. And this pattern of bluffing rather than genuine knowledge carried through to exam papers that were now displayed on the split screen with red ink markings, highlighting factual errors, incomplete recall, and logical gaps that required major rewrites, according to multiple faculty members, including Professor Alan Whitaker, who in his pre-recorded video segment expanded on how Trump frequently confused key economic principles and relied on selective memory that served him well in social settings but failed under academic scrutiny. And Jimmy then transitioned smoothly to even more archival material pulled from Dr. Martin Reynolds' expanding folder that had been brought on stage, showing original essays and notes with comments like lacks depth, unsupported claims missing substance, and relies on confidence and energy rather than rigorous reasoning, which Dr. Reynolds read aloud in his measured retired professor voice, emphasizing that while Trump showed ambition and charisma, his actual academic output rarely went beyond the superficial, and this testimony was backed by additional letters from other classmates who had come forward after the first segment aired, confirming similar experiences of Trump seeking help or shortcuts on assignments due to his self-described busy schedule. Helping his father and Jimmy allowed these revelations to breathe with long pauses that heightened the tension as Trump, when unmuted again, spiraled into repetitive loops of "I have the best memory, tremendous success, everybody knows it, I built an empire, you're jealous, very sad," which only made the contrast with the documented evidence more devastating as the audience began chanting show the papers," and laughing at every repeated phrase because the repetition itself became living proof of the very memory issues the professors had documented decades earlier. And as the segment progressed, Jimmy revealed yet another layer with court filings from the 1970s related to academic misrepresentation that Trump had quietly settled out of court, avoiding public scrutiny at the time, alongside an internal Trump Organization email from 2015 explicitly instructing staff to never release any academic records under any circumstance, which when displayed on the giant screen caused another wave of audible gasps and murmurs throughout the studio, because it suggested a long-term deliberate strategy of concealing the truth while publicly inflating his intellectual credentials for political and business gain. And Dr. Reynolds added even more weight by pulling out additional student evaluations and graded exams that painted a consistent picture of a student who performed adequately through a combination of legacy status, family connections, and occasional external help, but never demonstrated the exceptional analytical abilities or genius-level intellect that Trump would spend the next 50 years bragging about in rallies, interviews, books, and public statements, where he positioned himself as a stable genius with perfect recall, who understood complex issues better than anyone else, including generals, scientists, and economists. And Jimmy pressed on by asking Dr. Reynolds to compare the archived work directly to Trump's later claims about acing cognitive tests during his presidency, describing them as perfect scores of 120 out of 120 on the same 30 questions repeated, which stood in ironic opposition to the exam papers from Wharton that showed repeated struggles with retention and depth. And as the clock ticked through the extended live segment, the humiliation built layer by layer, with each new document and testimony chipping away at the carefully constructed myth, until Trump appeared genuinely exhausted on the monitor, his face glistening with sweat, his voice growing hoarse as he repeated the same tired defenses that no longer landed with the same force they once had, and the audience responded with a mix of cheers, boos, and sustained applause that reflected the national conversation shifting in real time as clips from the show began circulating online, with people across the country reacting to the receipts, the signatures, the professor notes, the bank transfers, and the eyewitness accounts that together formed an airtight case against the decades of exaggeration. And the segment closed with Jimmy reminding everyone that these were not attacks, but simply the records themselves speaking louder than any rally chant or self-aggrandizing statement ever could. And as the screen faded on Trump's frozen image, the weight of the evidence hung heavy in the air, setting the stage for even more revelations in subsequent episodes, where additional archives would be explored and more voices would come forward to confirm what the paperwork had already made clear, that the myth of the 220 IQ or 180 IQ stable genius was exactly that. A myth built on bravado, legacy advantages, and a refusal to let facts get in the way of a compelling personal narrative that had served him well in business and politics until it was forced under the bright lights of live television and subjected to the kind of scrutiny that no amount of shouting or suing could erase. And through it all, Jimmy Kimmel remained the calm, unflappable conductor of this unfolding drama, never raising his voice, but letting the documents and witnesses do the heavy lifting in a way that felt both entertaining and profoundly revealing about the power of truth when it is finally allowed to confront long-standing fiction. In the hours-long broadcast segment stretched on with extended discussions of each piece of evidence, including full readings of Professor Comment's email chains and assignment notes interspersed with analysis of how these patterns of behavior might have influenced Trump's later decision-making in business deals and political leadership, where similar tendencies toward bold assertions over detailed understanding were often observed by critics and supporters alike. And Richard Harlan stayed on for additional questioning, providing even more context about the competitive environment at Wharton in the late 1960s, where connections mattered as much as grades, and how Trump's approach of leveraging those connections while outsourcing the academic heavy lifting allowed him to maintain an image of success without the corresponding intellectual rigor. And this was further corroborated by Dr. Reynolds, who shared anecdotes from his teaching days about students like Trump, who excelled in presentation but faltered in substance. And as the conversation deepened, Jimmy occasionally unmuted Trump, only to allow brief responses that inevitably looped back to the same claims of perfection and superiority, which by this point elicited more laughter than intimidation from the studio audience and at home viewers who were witnessing the careful dismantling of a public persona that had been cultivated over half a century. And the paragraph continues with further elaboration on each document's contents, the historical context of legacy admissions at elite institutions in that era, the psychological profile suggested by consistent bragging about
intelligence as a defense mechanism, the comparisons to other public figures who face similar scrutiny, the immediate social media reactions trending with hashtags like receipts and stable genius, fact check the potential legal responses Trump threatened but had used before in similar situations, the long-term impact on his political brand, and the way this moment forced even some supporters to reconsider the foundations of the genius narrative they had accepted for years, all while maintaining the core focus on the evidence presented that night, which collectively totaled hundreds of pages of records, notes, and testimonies that painted a far more ordinary picture of academic performance than the extraordinary one Trump had sold to the public, and this extensive presentation filled the entire second part of the broadcast, creating a comprehensive takedown that was both thorough and relentless, yet delivered with Jimmy Kimmel's signature deadpan style that made the revelations land even harder, and by the end of this segment, the myth had been not just challenged, but systematically deconstructed piece by documented piece, leaving audiences with a clear choice between believing the archived realities or the repeated public assertions. And as the credits rolled after nearly an hour of continuous evidence and testimony, the conversation spilled over into news cycles, social platforms, and dinner tables across the nation, where the question of what constitutes true intelligence and the dangers of unchecked self-mythologizing became central topics of discussion that would continue for weeks and months afterward, ensuring that the plain manila folder and its contents would remain a symbol of accountability in the face of decades of bravado.